Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks to Ian and to the Heritage Council for the invitation to talk about our project. As Jackie said, I'm going to talk about the Old Fort Cultural Quarter and the HCI project that we had funded in 2018. I'm the Heritage Officer with Laois County Council, and as other people have said, there's obviously a team involved in this, so I worked with the town engineer in Portlaoise, the senior planner and the director of services, as well as our design team, so I'm reporting on all of their work as well as mine. We're going to start with just a very short background on the fort and Portlaoise, just to give a context for it, describe the projects that we carried out under the Historic Towns Initiative, just a bit of information on the funding and the outcomes and the lessons learned, because when I was thinking about what to say this morning, what I was hoping to do was share some of our experiences, the good and the not so good, that might be helpful for other people who are hoping to do projects like this in the future. So the town of Portlaoise grew up around the fort in the 1560s. So the fabric of the fort is very much there at the centre of the town, almost, as Jackie said, almost invisible. And the old town, which is the red here, is bounded by the railway station, or the railway line here. The town then is bounded to the south by the motorway just off the slide here. And much as Alison described earlier on, we have the old town, which developed in the 1560s and further on, followed then by the new town, which has developed to the south and is characterised by the retail parks and the retail developments, the offices and the buildings, and they're separated by this 4-lane highway down through the middle of James Finch and Lawler Avenue, which has effectively divided the town and has produced great challenges. And the challenge for us was how to reunite the town, the north and the south of the town. On the positive side, the railway station is within close walking distance of the old town. The new town is a very short distance from the old town, but because of the break there with the road, people don't walk from one part to the other. So we've got a new town on the south that's thriving, that's lots of businesses happening in, and an old town which is not thriving. So the Fort Protector was built by the Crown Forces in the 1560s, and there wasn't a huge settlement here before that. It was built to suppress the warring Gaelic tribes, and the town grew up then following that building. This the square of the fort. So in the following centuries, the fort actually only operated as a fort for about 100 years. The town grew up around it, and the fort has been gradually forgotten and hidden from view. However, the fabric is almost entirely extant, although clearly hidden and poorly presented. So this is just a quick sketch. So the red solid line here shows where the fort wall is extant, and the dotted line shows where we know where the line is, but it's gone. On the northeastern and the northwestern corners, it's open to the public and visible. On this edge here, it forms the back wall of all of the properties, many of the properties on the main street. On this side here, it's been breached and modified. In the centre then, we've got institutional use. We've got a large school here, and this is a council yard here. And then this is just private developments over one corner of it. So it's had, I suppose it's benefited in some ways by the institutional uses, so that it hasn't been taken down as it may have been. The challenge then for the town and the historic core of the town, as I mentioned, the new developments at the side of the town, the secondary schools, which had been at the centre of the town, one of them inside the fort, as I showed you there, have left. They've moved to the edge of town. 2 primary schools, one of them inside the fort and one of them part of the historic fabric of the town just outside the fort, left the centre of town in 2017. So we now have 2 massive school campuses right on the edge of town and a massive hole in the centre of town. There's little trading off the main street, there's very little residential in the town centre, and what was a busy area, a very busy area, in the last couple of years was now facing dereliction and a very uncertain future. So with these challenges in mind, Laois County Council commissioned a public realm study in 2016. It was published in 2017, which brings in a range of proposals for the historic town core, focusing on, this is the centre, the road that I mentioned that divides the south part, the new town, from the old town, but focusing on the permeability here, bringing the 2 sides of the town together, and a range of proposals for the historic core to basically bring back the life into the town and focusing on the heritage and the historic structure. Our Historic Towns Initiative project then was to do phase 1 of what we described as a 2-phase project to promote regeneration of the historic core through the conservation and development of the Fort Protector. Because it was a large project, we broke it into two parts. And for the Historic Towns Initiative in 2018, what we planned to do was conservation of masonry on one side of the fort protector walls, improvement of the public realm through paving and lighting and removal of street clutter, and New Fitzmaurice Park with a performance space, a public area with a high quality public realm. We were allocated originally 160,000 under the Historic Towns Initiative in March of last year, and there was an addition to that then in July, which meant that the total budget was 185,000. This is Fitzmaurice Place, the public space that I mentioned before work started. The fort is there, but it's almost completely invisible. This is the round bastion at the northern tip of the fort. It continues, the walls are completely there, up the street there, almost completely invisible. And here is the 16th century tower of Old St. Peter's Church, which was the first church built on the site. The wall is actually is almost completely there, but invisible. This is a massive granary building, mass concrete granary building, which dates back to the mill that was on the site. Odlum's mills were on the whole of this area up until the 1960s. And this public space is very busy, underutilised public space, which doesn't reflect the wall at all, doesn't reflect the historic core of the town, is what we aimed to improve through the Historic Towns Initiative. So that's a map of what we were planning to do. Here is this Fitzmaurice Place, where we plan to reduce the levels. It actually rose in the centre, which we didn't know why until later, but I'll come back to that. It rose in the centre, which meant that the ground was rising in front of the wall, which is what helped, which meant that the wall was almost completely invisible. The fort wasn't visible. So we planned to take the levels down to what they would have originally been, show off the wall a bit better, soften it with a public park instead of all the concrete that was there, conserve the wall along the side here, which is the area of Church Avenue, and improve lighting, public realm, paving, all of that to take down all the clutter. That was phase one. Phase two then, simply for budget reasons, was to take down this massive granary building. It's actually used as a council yard at the moment, so the expense of taking it down plus the expense of housing the council staff elsewhere meant that it was put into the phase two. Phase two of the project then envisaged continuing the improvements in public realm up the wall here to Tower Hill, the conservation of the wall, and wrapping it around here to Railway Street and into Old St. Peter's Graveyard, which is just outside the fort walls. So that's the phasing there, phase one in the blue, phase two in the purple, and a later phase proposed in the public realm plan, which is to link Fitzmaurice Place down through the convent grounds to the River Tryoak, which is the small river that goes through Portlaoise. We had planned originally as well to provide public access to the fort. There's actually no public access to the centre of the fort at all at the moment, and our plan was to produce a wooden platform which would allow public access into the bastion and to allow people to see out what would have been the view out from the fort, and that was moved to phase two for budget reasons, so it's now planned for this year. I think Roisin mentioned the preparatory work that needs to be done before a project like this, and I think it was mentioned in Kilmallock as well. We had a lot of work in train or finished before we started this application. We had a full laser measured survey of the fort walls. The Laois Heritage Society had been working for a number of years with Heritage Council community funding on a conservation plan that was just completed. There was a huge range of public consultation associated with that conservation plan, and also then with the public realm plan, which the council had done just the previous year. Portlaoise Tidy Towns had been working away on a conservation programme at Old St. Peter's Church and Graveyard, also with the Heritage Council funding for a number of years, and that was ongoing. We had a few cultural projects, the Old Fort Festival, which actually grew up organically when the traders in the town became energised as a result of the people doing the conservation plan knocking on doors and telling them about the wall at the back. So they started this Old Fort Festival, which is a music festival with a nod towards heritage in the daytime, brings thousands of people into the town centre, and everybody now knows the logo that they used is the shape of the fort with the round bastion and the square tower, and it's really increased the visibility and the awareness of the fort simply just by hooking it onto it, and also really sort of demonstrated that they see the value of it. The local traders see the value of the fort in their business, not just as a heritage creation. So that's funded through Laois County Council, the Heritage Council. Creative Ireland have also funded some of the cultural projects there. And also at the same time as we started, the HTI this year, where there was a heritage interpretation plan commissioned by Laois Heritage Society, funded again by a community grant from the Heritage Council. You might be starting to see a pattern here. the huge importance of Heritage Council funding in the background. So that was all in place. We had what we wanted to do. We knew more or less what the plan was. We had applied for our project. We did procure and appoint a conservation architect in advance because we don't have a conservation officer on staff. So we worked with Richard McLaughlin of Laois Architecture on the application, and he stayed on with us to implement the project. But once we heard about the funding in March, we still needed Part 8. We still needed, obviously, archaeological consent. We went for Section 57 for the works to the wall because we were hoping that would be faster. These things don't always work out as you go. We still had to put together our full design team, which included a QS, archaeologist, landscape architect, structural engineer, lighting specialist, and our own team. So quite a lot of people involved, but everybody was really essential to the project. In an attempt to address the timing issues, because from March to the end of the year really is only 6 months of actual work. We broke the contract into 4 parts. We started with the site clearance. We procured separately the masonry conservation, because obviously that's quite a specialist job. The lighting was in existence under a framework with the council already, and the paving and landscaping was done through SupplyGov. So that's just the management of it. The project timeline, as I mentioned, we had the funding confirmed in June. We had our planning consents all in place. The funding confirmed in March. Planning consents in place by June. We didn't start on site with the clearance works until August. The masonry conservation started on site in September. In November, we did our grant drawdown because the funding was well and truly spent by that stage. So it's a much bigger project than just the HTI funding allocated to it. So we drew down, and thanks to the Heritage Council for their help and their flexibility in the drawdown of the funding in that. So here we are in January. The site clearance works are complete. Masonry conservation is just waiting for a good spell of weather to be complete, and we're about to start the paving and landscaping contract on Monday. We're hoping that phase 1 will be complete in March of this year. So I mentioned a couple of times the time frame and the issues. The time frame is very, very tight, there's no doubt, to get everything planned, procured and implemented on site in essentially 6 months. The consents are important, the health and safety is important, the procurement all has to be done. They all take their own time, and I think you can see from our timeline, they proceed as they proceed. There's not really much you can do about some of those time frames. We did run into unexpected findings below ground. I mentioned that the ground rose towards the fort, and we didn't know why. But when we dug, we found that the old concrete silos that the mill building had used had all just been knocked off and built on top of. So there was a massive amount of mass concrete on site, which caused a lot of delay, and it caused a lot of budget increases on that aspect. And in a way, it meant that we were just as well we had started with the site clearance at the beginning, because it meant that we could cut our cloth to suit our measure for the remainder of the contract. There's small pictures here, but it's just showing the piles of concrete that were taken out. They had to be taken out, crushed and taken off site, and it was a slow and laborious process. We also uncovered the mill race of the original mill, which wasn't a significant problem. We more or less knew where it was, but it was interesting to find. Obviously, because we were there, we were able to record it and make it safe, and it's still there below the ground. It still carries what we think is the original course of the River Triogue, so it's still wet. People were very interested in looking down into that. And then weather issues, which construction later in the year, especially with lime, is not ideal. But because it's not finished, I have to show you an architect's impression of what it's going to look like when it's finished. So you're all going to have to come to Portlaoise and see it for yourselves in reality. So what we will have is the ground now sloping away from the wall. The wall and the tower will be the first thing that you see. It'll be presented in such a way that it draws your eye up the street, along the wall, to St. Peter's, and that's for the rest of that's just outside the wall. So you can see the extent basically of the fort on those two sides. This is a monument to Colonel Fitzmaurice, a Portlaoise man who was on the first flight from Europe to North America across the Atlantic. So he's Fitzmaurice Place. That's what Fitzmaurice Place is named after, and that sculpture has been there, and it's just going to be relocated. So that's what it's going to look like at the end. The lessons learned, I can't emphasise enough that the early work, the preparatory work that we did, that other groups had done, and the Heritage Council support for that through Heritage Plan funding and also through community grants was absolutely crucial. None of this would have happened without that. A public realm plan, I think Ciara mentioned earlier, a public realm plan was certainly essential for us. There was no way we would have probably got the funding or been able to do the project without that. The importance of early collaboration with the traders, the residents, the parish, the schools, the heritage societies, the tidy towns groups. That was all done already in advance because we'd been working there for the last 5 years, and it meant that when we started digging on the ground, when we advertised Part 8, when we caused people problems with their traffic, everyone knew what it was about and nobody had any issues with it. The time frame is very tight, and you really need to have everything in place, ideally, before the funding is allocated in an ideal world. For us, the Historic Towns Initiative has been incredibly positive. It happened at exactly the right time. It put heritage front and centre, and for us in Portlaoise, we had a number of small projects all working around the fort, sorted separately, sorted together, and what this allowed us to do was draw them all together and gave a crucial injection of support just at the right time. It's very specific, it's very focused on heritage in a really good way. It means that all of the senior management who suddenly see this as an opportunity are talking about the value of heritage, the importance of heritage, the historic core of the town, the way they never really were for us anyway before. We found it very well regulated without being too bureaucratic, and thanks for that. It will eventually build and is already building confidence in our town centre, and the ultimate aim is to bring residents and visitors back to the town centre. We were really, I feel, fortunate in that we were ready for the Historic Towns Initiative. Because we were ready for the Historic Towns Initiative, we were ready for the URDF. So we applied for the remainder of the projects under the Urban Regeneration funding, and we were allocated 3.1 million for this year, and hopefully more in the coming years. What that will do is finish phase 1, finish phase 2, put in the public access, allow the removal of the granary, finish all the public realm all the way around, bring St. Peter's Graveyard into the same part of the fort, so the conservation works there will all be implemented. The Scullwurra site, the modern school inside the fort, was acquired by Laois County Council during the Historic Towns Initiative, and all of these things wouldn't have happened without the Historic Towns Initiative. That's going to be refurbished, and it's going to be the new home of the Laois School of Music. Portlaoise Library, which is just adjacent to it, was happening anyway, is now being brought into the URDF funding, and we'll have this walkway to link the fort through the Presentation Convent with the River Trio Blueway, which links all the residential areas of town with this massive new school campus. So at least we have the schools right on the edge of town, but there is a planned walkway to link them together. There's housing development planned in the Presentation Convent, housing and parking development in the Forbes CBS lands, the other secondary school. There's other redevelopments. So really, for us, the Historic Towns Initiative, it's not an exaggeration to say that it's brought around a wave of change in the town centre, focused on the heritage. The URDF wouldn't have been possible without the HTI. The HTI meant that the URDF was genuinely heritage-led and will catalyse further projects. So our sincere thanks to the Heritage Council, to the Department of Culture and Heritage, and the Gaeltacht for their assistance and for their confidence in the town of Portlaoise. And I leave you with that. That was said in a different context. We're not makers of history, we are made by history, but I think it's apt for here today. Thank you.